3 in the morning. The only light in the room came from the monitor, casting a harsh glow against the wall. Jing sat motionless, her fingers hovering over the keys, but they did not move. On the screen, a single vertical line blinked in a steady, mocking rhythm. It was a heartbeat of wasted time. She had been sitting there for 4 hours, staring at a document that remained as empty as when she had opened it. Every morning for the last 6 months, she had followed the same rigid schedule. Wake at 5, review the goals, start the work. Yet, as the sun set each day, the progress bars stayed fixed at 0. She leaned forward, pressing her palms hard into her eye sockets until sparks danced in the dark. She tried to force a sentence, typed 3 words, and immediately hit backspace until the screen was blank again. The silence of the apartment felt heavy. She looked at the cursor. It blinked once, twice, 3 times. It was a countdown to nothing. She pulled her hands away from the keyboard. The project was not moving. She was not moving. She sat back, the chair creaking in the quiet room, and watched the cursor continue its relentless, rhythmic pulse. She reached for her phone. The screen lit up, illuminating her face with a harsh blue glare. A notification popped up. A friend had just announced a major promotion. Jing stared at the text. The words seemed to vibrate, mocking her own lack of movement. She set the phone face down on the desk with a sharp click. The silence of the apartment felt louder now, pressing against her skin. She stood up, her legs stiff from hours of sitting, and began to pace. She walked from the desk to the window, then back to the desk, her footsteps echoing against the hardwood. She stopped at the mirror hanging near the doorway. She leaned in close, her breath fogging the glass. She traced the dark, heavy circles under her eyes with a trembling finger. The face, looking back, was tired, worn thin by months of invisible effort. She pressed her palms against the cool surface of the mirror, searching for a sign of the person she used to be. She lowered her head, closing her eyes to shut out the reflection. "Maybe I am just not cut out for this," she whispered into the glass. She turned away from the mirror, walked to the kitchen, and poured a cup of cold, bitter coffee into the sink. The liquid had swirled down the drain, disappearing in seconds. She grabbed her coat and left. The night air hit her like a physical weight, cold and damp against her skin. She walked without direction, her boots clicking against the pavement until the city sounds faded into the distance. She reached the park entrance. The scent of wet soil and decaying leaves rose up to meet her, thick and grounding. She crossed the grass, her pace slowing as the trees closed in around her. She found a wooden bench near a willow tree and sat, letting her shoulders drop. The silence here was different. It was not the empty, pressurized silence of her desk. It was expansive. She stared into the dark, trying to steady her breathing. Then, a soft scraping sound drew her attention. A few feet away, an old man sat on a stone stool. He held a bamboo brush, dipping it into a small, dark pot of ink. He leaned over a long scroll of rice paper. His hand moved with agonizing slowness, dragging the brush across the fiber. He did not rush. He did not look up. Jing watched the man for 10 minutes. Her leg bounced rhythmically, a nervous tick she could not suppress. She counted the seconds between his movements. 5, 10, 15. The brush barely traveled an inch. Her own chest felt tight, a physical manifestation of the months she had wasted staring at a blinking cursor. The sight of his empty paper began to grate on her nerves. It looked like her own life, static, unproductive, and stalled. She stood up, her joints popping in the quiet park air. She walked over, stopping just behind his shoulder. She looked down at the scroll. The frustration she had been carrying for 6 months surged upward, demanding an outlet. She pointed a sharp, accusing finger at the paper. "You have been working for a long time," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness with an edge of bitterness. "But the paper is still mostly empty." She stood there, looming over him, her breath shallow and uneven, waiting for the man to defend his lack of progress. The man looked up. His eyes were clear, holding no trace of the defensiveness Jing expected. He did not blink. He set the brush aside, its tip still wet with ink, and pointed a gnarled finger at the soil beneath the willow tree. "Do you see the roots of this tree?" he asked. Jing looked down. She saw only dark, packed earth and a few protruding knots of wood. She shook her head. "They are working," he said, his voice low and steady. They are pushing through rocks and clay. They are searching for water in the dark. It is silent, invisible work. He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the trunk. If the tree stopped, because it could not see its own growth, it would die. The words hit Jing like a physical blow. She felt the tension in her shoulders snap. For months, she had been staring at the surface, measuring her life by the empty space on her screen. The park seemed to grow quiet, the wind dying down until the only thing she could hear was the rhythmic pulse in her own ears. Her breath hitched. The man extended his hand. The bamboo brush sat in his palm, the bristles dark and heavy with ink. Jing hesitated. She looked at the blank expanse of rice paper, its surface pristine and intimidating. Her fingers reached out, closing around the smooth wood. The brush felt heavier than she expected, a physical weight that seemed to anchor her to the moment. Her hand began to tremble. She stared at the spot where she intended to make her mark. Her breath held tight in her chest. The urge to pull back clawed at her. She forced her knuckles to relax. She lowered the tip of the brush. It touched the paper, leaving a small, dark bead of ink. She pulled it across the surface. The line was thin, slightly jagged, and undeniably imperfect. It looked like a beginning. She lifted the brush, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mark remained, a permanent, visible proof of her presence. She looked at the man. He offered a slow, deliberate nod. The silence of the park no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a space waiting to be filled. Jing returned to her desk, the memory of the park still sharp. She did not open the laptop immediately. Instead, she wrote a single sentence on a sticky note and pressed it against the monitor. The next morning, she ignored the clock entirely. She refused to check her friend's progress. She opened the file and wrote one paragraph. It took 20 minutes. The familiar, sharp urge to hit backspace and delete the entire block flared in her chest, a reflex born of months of self-doubt. She hovered her finger over the key, her pulse quickening. She stopped. She forced her hand away, saved the file, and closed the laptop. This became her new ritual. Some days, she produced 3 pages of dense text. Other days, she managed only a single, fragile sentence. She stopped measuring her worth by the final output and started observing the process itself. She treated the writing like the roots of the tree, pushing through the resistance of the page without needing to see the fruit. Day after day, the pattern held. She was no longer racing. She was simply building. The 30th day arrived with the same quiet routine. Jing sat at her desk, but this time, she did not start a new paragraph. She moved the cursor to the file icon and clicked. The document opened, filling the screen with text. She placed her hand on the mouse and began to scroll. She expected to see the familiar gaps, the empty spaces that had haunted her for months. Instead, the screen blurred with dense, black lines. She scrolled faster, her eyes tracking the sheer volume of words. 1 page, 5 pages, 10. By the time she reached the bottom, the counter read 20 pages. She leaned back, the chair creaking in the stillness of the room. The weight of the work was tangible, a physical record of her persistence. She looked at the text, not for flaws, but for the evidence of her own motion. The frustration that had defined her mornings vanished, replaced by a cold, clear clarity. She realized then that the feeling of being stuck had never been about her speed. She had been starving for a harvest before she had even finished planting the seeds. The screen glowed, no longer a mirror of her inadequacy, but a map of her own steady, invisible growth. Jing reached out and touched the screen, her fingertips tracing the lines of text she had labored to create. The silence of the apartment no longer felt like a void. It felt like a workspace. She picked up her pen, the weight of it familiar and balanced. She turned to a fresh, clean page in her notebook. There was no pressure to produce a masterpiece, no phantom clock ticking. She simply placed the nib against the fiber of the paper and began to write the next chapter. The ink flowed in a steady, rhythmic line, mirroring the patience she had learned beneath the willow tree. She did not look for a sign of success in the world outside her window. She did not wait for approval or a milestone to validate her existence as a creator. She realized that the search for a sign was a distraction. She was the one moving the pen. She was the one pushing through the resistance of the blank page. She was the one choosing to show up every single day. As she finished the first paragraph, She set the pen down and looked at the words. They were hers. She was no longer waiting for a sign of success to arrive. She was the sign, carved into the paper by her own hand, one stroke at a time, moving forward into the quiet, steady rhythm of her own life.